So as I mentioned yesterday, the content of my talk has altered, but I think most of the title can stay the same, except that I'm adding this subtitle on the question of infrastructure. And I want to talk about infrastructure mainly because a colleague of mine recently wrote something that I thought was very provocative about this. And this is from his book, The Marvelous Clouds, Towards a Philosophy of Elemental Media. And he says well, I'll just read what he says here. I am loath to introduce yet another ism into the scrimmage of academic brands, but if I were to do so, it would be the doctrine of infrastructuralism. After structuralism, with its ambition to explain the principles of thought, primitive or modern, by way of a combinatorics of meaning, that would be Levi-Strauss and so on, and post-structuralism with its love of gaps, aporias, and impossibilities, its celebration of breakdown, yearning, and failure, its relish for preposterous categories of all time, and love of breathless syntax. And by this, I think he means primarily Jacques Derrida, Paul de Man, and so on. Perhaps it is time for infrastructuralism. Its fascination is for the basic, the boring, the mundane, and all the mischievous work done behind the scenes. It is a doctrine of environments and small differences, of straight gates and the needle's eye, of things not understood that stand under our worlds. That idea of things standing under our world as an infrastructural idea is something he sees as a pun in Marshall McLuhan's famous book, Understanding Media. It's the media that stand under in understanding our world. So I found this to be a very provocative idea, and I'm one of those people that think that this sort of infrastructural turn in critical discourse is fascinating and worthwhile. But I wanted to argue a little bit with how we got to this point. And specifically, I want to look again at the work of Jacques Derrida and argue that his deconstruction or his post-structuralism was always already infrastructuralism. And that what Derrida meant by writing was really just an old name for an infrastructural cluster of possibilities. And infrastructure is one of those words that, as I said earlier yesterday, it means below the structure, but it tends to embody all of those things that disappear or seem invisible when they're working properly. We think of them tend to be as like roads and networks and large systems, but they can also be just the surfaces and tables and floors and things we interact with day to day that tend to disappear into an infrastructural invisibility when they're working properly. Now, in order for me to argue that Derrida is doing something like this already in his description of the philosophical problem of writing, I'm presuming another familiarity with the scene that I think I described last year, or the last time that we met together in Berkeley. And this is a scene in Plato's Phaedrus, where Socrates is telling the story of the invention of writing. And it's an invention between an inventor god, Thoth, of the Egyptian mythology, and the king of the Egyptians, Thamus. And so in this scene, Socrates is telling the story, and the god Thoth, who's invented letters, writing, comes and says, "This invention, O king, will make the Egyptians wiser and will improve their memories, for it's an elixir of memory and wisdom that I've discovered." But the king, Thamus, replies, "Most ingenious Thoth, one man has the ability to beget arts, but the ability to judge of their usefulness or harmfulness to their users belongs to another. And now you, who are the father of letters, have been led by your affection to ascribe to them a power the opposite of that which they really possess. For this invention will produce forgetfulness in the minds of those who learn to use it, because they will not practice their memory. Their trust in writing produced by external characters, which are no part of themselves, will discourage the use of their own memory within them. You've invented an elixir, not of memory, but of reminding." And those are interesting distinctions there. "And you offer your pupils the appearance of wisdom, but not true wisdom, for they will read many things without instruction, and will therefore seem to know many things when they are, for the most part, ignorant." And it's important to know a couple of interesting things with regard to the original Greek here. Forgetfulness is the word lethe, which has to do with crossing over into the river of death and forgetfulness. And these words, the elixir is not a pharmacon, which is where we get pharmacology and drugs and so on. And what Plato writes here is not of memory and amnesis, but of reminding, hypomnesis. And this is an important distinction between anamnesis and hypomnesis in Socrates and in generally what follows in the Western philosophical description of writing. Anamnesis is understood to be memory that exists inside you, is for Socrates especially, is thought of as evidence of a pre-earth life. It's also evidence of presence. It's self-presencing in an important way, this kind of memory. And it constitutes real and true learning. Hypomnesis, on the other hand, is this memory that exists outside you. It is technical, material. It is evidence of a kind of absence because it can always be removed from the scene of one's articulation of meaning. And it's not real or true learning. And so there's this immediate hierarchization of forms of mnemonic experience wherein what happens inside you in the interiority of your memory is presencing and full of this kind of metaphysics of self-presence, and memory that is outside you that you put into whatever form or media you choose, everything from stone to digital apparatuses, is considered hypomnesis and therefore evidence of absence and not true learning. Now, when I read Derrida, what I find is that his overarching ambition was to essentially overturn this distinction. That to say that this long-standing Platonic contradiction between anamnesis and hypomnesis is really a false thing, and that writing, as it says here, is just an old name for an infrastructural cluster of possibilities. I take that to be essentially a one-line summary of these three very important books by Jacques Derrida: Grammatology, Writing Indifference, and the much later archive Fever. Now, what I want to point to today then in sort of making this case for Derrida's work as a kind of infrastructuralist philosophy, I want to look specifically at an essay that's contained in Writing Indifference that he published in the mid-1960s called Freud and the Scene of Writing. Now, one of the reasons that Derrida was so interested in Freud was that he challenged, in a way, the metaphysics of presence by essentially, from the very beginning, claiming that we are never fully present to ourselves. What we think of as consciousness is really like someone holding a candle and walking around a dark and enormous house, right? That you have this unconscious realm somewhere in you that in which all of these repressed memories and all of these sort of even sort of inherited proclivities and things are constantly operating in the form of drives and inclinations and so on that you may not even be aware of yourself. So just in the very notion of the unconscious, Freud immediately challenges the metaphysics of presence. But he also falls short in many ways, and we're going to talk about that a little bit as well. Of course, the claim that Freud makes is that psychoanalysis, through the talking cure, through conjuring up these memories that have been repressed and so on, can overcome this self-absence. I actually find an interesting parallel between the way that practitioners of mindfulness talk about coming into self-presence and what Freud was talking about with sort of achieving a kind of individuation and higher states of consciousness by accessing the unconscious, to be sort of interestingly similar. But how exactly did Freud get here? This is the story that Jacques Derrida wants to explore in this really fascinating sort of overlook of Freud's entire career. A lot of people forget that Freud began his career doing histological drawings of neurological pathways. He was one of the first people to really get into the microscope and began his career basically drawing neurons and trying to figure out how they operated. This was, of course, consistent with the development of staining techniques that made neurons suddenly legible, because before the Golgi staining methods, and even some of the methods that Freud himself invented for uncovering this, it was very hard to even find a neuron. The whole idea that there would be this, you know, a little cell with branching dendrites and things was sort of inconceivable until they could stain it and make it legible through the microscope. But Freud ran into a kind of immediate difficulty in trying to understand neurons and the processes, and he essentially projected in 1895 that there's this kind of inherent dual system in mental operations. This is one thing that neuroscientists still think about. Because on the one hand, neurological processes, according to Freud, must be capable of forging pathways. His word was Bahnung, which is in English is translated as breaching. But this is essentially a kind of pathway through the neurons that allows for the retention of memories. It inscribes, leaves a kind of engraving of furrows, generating memories, allowing for learning and so on. And this can be because of the power of cathected emotion, or it could also be just that something happens over and over and over again. And so those pathways are sort of inscribed somehow in the mind. There's a record there. On the other hand, he says those same cellular processes must also maintain what he calls an unlimited receptive capacity in order to allow for the continuous perception of sensory experience. That is, maintain a refreshable surface for receiving. There has to be a kind of erasable operation that allows those same neurons to receive information. So he says it's one of the peculiarities of the nervous system that it seems to be capable of both retaining and receiving, and of both being influenced and also unaltered and unprejudiced. So it's almost like there's this strange dichotomy. And what Freud saw when he was looking at these cells was that, or what he finally concluded was that there was no way he was ever going to discover the mind and this dual system by simply looking at morphological drawings of the cells themselves, or even through the microscope. So he began, his drawings through his career begin to evolve, whereas in the beginning they're very descriptive, almost sort of photographic in his drawings of the cells, and they begin to become more schematic. So this is 1895. Here you can see him literally trying to diagram the dual operation of cellular material, allowing for both memory and the refreshable surface of perception. By the 1920s and 1930s, he's kind of replaced these by notions of the ego, the id, and his drawings become almost entirely diagrammatic and schematic, and so on. Now, what Derrida notices is that something very interesting happens for Freud, which is that throughout his career, he's constantly searching for the right metaphor for how to describe this operation. And in 1925, he writes an essay called the Notiz über den Wunderblock, or a note upon the mystic writing pad, in which he describes this interesting new invention in the world of writing pads. I have here an example. This is from the 1930s, an American-made mystic writing pad. But essentially what happens is there are 3 layers within a mystic writing pad. There's the sort of waxy substrate of this. There's a middle layer of a kind of tissue paper and a kind of celluloid clear surface on the top. And some of you may have had toys like this when you were children or remember something like this, but essentially what it allows for is for a kind of, if you take a stylus or even, just your fingernail and you write on the celluloid surface, it retains an inscription. When you lift that surface and clear it and erase it, it still maintains this sort of sunken impression that can then be written over. Now, of course, Freud found this a very interesting metaphor for the operations of the psyche, right? Because he essentially said, this wax substrate is the unconscious, where memories are inscribed in the wax, somehow preserved there, even if they're not accessible. The tissue paper is what he called the preconscious, where things can be called up into consciousness. And the refreshable, erasable surface is the celluloid, which he calls consciousness, right? Now, what happens in his essay, though, is that he gets right about to the end of it, and he kind of gives up a little bit. Right at the end, he says, well, there must come a point at which the analogy between an auxiliary apparatus of this kind, this hypomnesis, this writing that is exterior, and the organ which is its prototype will cease to apply. It is true, too, that once writing has been erased, the mystic pad cannot reproduce it from within. It would be a mystic pad indeed if, like our memory, it could accomplish that. So he somehow retreats from this as anything but a kind of thesis or analogy. And what Derrida wants to say is actually there's something really wrong here, because he's abandoning the role of prosthesis in the generation of the mind and memory. So Derrida says Freud's gesture at this point is extremely Platonic. Only the writing of the soul, said the Phaedrus, only the psychical trace is able to reproduce and to represent itself spontaneously. The pad arrives serendipitously as an analogic object, but abandoned to itself, the multiplicity of layered surfaces of the apparatus is a dead complexity without depth, with Freud finally implying that life as depth belongs only to the wax of psychical memory. Now, in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and skip along here to just argue that a lot of other people have basically made the same mistake when thinking about the mystic writing pad. There is this kind of universal assumption I discovered as I went back and read every single, article or essay that I could find or book about Freud's essay on the mystic writing pad, and everyone seems to assume that it was a child's toy, right? That it's a new children's toy that appeared at the time, that it was a toy sold for children, just a toy, and so on and so on. And I think this is because there was a kind of market dominance for these particular magic slate pads that were produced by a company called Strathmore in Aurora, Illinois in the 1940s and 50s, in which you basically had this streamlined version. They were always these co-marketed, branded things that allowed for people to, give them to children and occupy them as a kind of novelty. But because of the pandemic, I was able to go to some archives in Europe, that is sort of metaphorically, and discover that in fact, the mystic writing pad as Freud first encountered it was not at all a children's toy. It was something very, very technologically advanced and interesting. So here, for example, is an advertisement by a guy named August Stier for Erapi der Wunderblock. Here you notice that translation here is that it writes without lead or ink, no eraser wiping needed, comes perfectly sized for your office, briefcase, or vest pocket. And what I noticed was that the invention itself was appearing in all of these technological journals, these journals where people are actually trying to promote it as a kind of clerical technology for a variety of things. There was a Jewish company that actually was manufacturing these in Berlin, and they actually called their version of the mystic writing tablet, here you can see mystic writing tablet, the Printator. And the innovation that they brought to this was to streamline the lifting of the pad surface so that you could simply, and I actually have one here, if you can see my screen still from the 1930s, where simply pulling out the bottom wax surface would allow it to erase. And what you notice in these advertisements from the 1920s is that you get the sense that a magically erasing pad was not just a childish novelty, that it signaled the arrival of a form of mnemotechnics that could be personally adapted and marketed as essential to one's most intimate and important life experiences, promising as well a way of navigating the ever-rising flood of ephemeral information that constituted modern life. So notice, for instance, in the advertisement in La Illustration, Madame, note your dates on the elegant and durable Printator notepad. Notice the language of ease and efficiency in the Almanico Italiano, always ready, huge saving on papers and pencils. Notice here the assurances of strategic ephemerality and medium stability in the bookseller and stationery trades journals. Words disappear on this everlasting notebook. Or the subtler but no less powerful double system of erasure and forgetting that a consumer could be reminded of a given product or name in this advertisement from the Netherlands. Every time you pull the card out, the branded whatever you're selling could be seen as an advertisement there. An advertisement from the Times of India only half jokingly asserts, lovers too may find it useful when the occasion demands discretion as well as ardor. IOUs may be written for fabulous amounts with impunity, incriminating documents, confessions, even sonnets may be risked, for with one pull, everything written has gone forever. Now, all of these promises, of course, sound hokey when imagined as operating in the realm of a child's toy or something, but as embodied in the hyper-modern business-oriented Printator, they feel positively oracular, like a prefiguration of what we now recognize as the everyday experience of being with screens. In the final 30 seconds of my presentation, I just want to point out that the company that was making these, the Jewish company in the 1920s, was in 1938 Aryanized after Kristallnacht and taken over by a non-Jewish firm, and essentially began selling these pads to the Luftwaffe as places where the navigational processes of dead reckoning could be calculated on them as well. And that this is basically, I think, underscoring the point that infrastructuralism is what Jacques Derrida was always talking about with deconstruction, with post-structuralism. So I'll leave it at that.